Thank you very much for having me, and thanks to the TEDx crew. I want to talk about terrorism and finance, connecting the dots. What comes to mind when you think of the word terrorism? There are various stereotypes. I've discussed this issue at length with friends, classmates, professors, doctors, and the like. And it seems to be centered around 2 or 3 concepts. I hear words like Arab, Islam, and the like. Is this the case? I'll leave you with that question to ponder on as I go through my talk. There are many perspectives to terrorism, obviously. There's the politics, there's the finance, there's the media. But I want to focus on the finance aspect. Before we can go on to the finance part of terrorism, I first of all want to clarify some assumptions about what terrorism is all about. What is terrorism? We can see 3 major concepts there. It is an unlawful act of violence, intimidates government or societies, and the goal is to achieve political, religious, or ideological objectives. This is what terrorism consists of. Misconceptions about terrorism. Is it really all about the violence? Is it really just about people killing people? I'm afraid that is not the case. As we can see from the definition below, in the previous slide, intimidation is the key. To put fear into the minds of people, to control what you do, what you say, how you say it, where you go to, who you talk with. They want power over people and governments. They want to put fear into us. A popular male billionaire who has been spreading a lot of hatred talks about putting restrictions. And worse still, he has a lot of supporters following him. Why is this the case? Because of fear. And when we are afraid, we make rash decisions. I also want to talk about some other misconceptions. Any ties to Islam? The media seems to give us the case that, as some talk show hosts have said, that 10% of Muslims are terrorists. Wow, that's a startling figure. The world Muslim population is about 1.5 billion. And if 10% are terrorists, then we are talking about 150 million potential terrorists roaming around the earth. And if each one were to carry out a terrorist attack, killing 40 people each, then all non-Muslim life on the planet would be eradicated. This is obviously not the case. Let's bring it home. In the University of Kent here, there are over 500 Muslims. If we were to follow that assumption, that would mean that we have 50 potential terrorists walking around the campus. And then that would be surprising, considering that this university has been existing for over 50 years, and there has been no recorded terrorist attack. Obviously, this is wrong, and the media has it wrong. The FBI's position. Surprisingly, a study was carried out by the FBI between 1980 and 2005, and it was discovered that terrorist attacks on US soil, 94% of them were committed by non-Muslims. Only 6% of terrorist attacks in the United States have been committed by Muslims. Wow, this is surprising. I'm happy about these statistics because at least now we can sleep with our eyes closed, go about our daily activities without being scared that a potential Muslim walking around or a potential Arab is a potential terrorist. It's also worth noting here that only 20% of Muslims are Arabs. Definitely, this shows that the majority of Muslims are not even from the Arab world. So this conception about Islam and Arab is obviously false. Now that I've clarified those assumptions, I want to talk about terrorism financing. Basically, the financing of terrorism. As most people, this doesn't automatically come to mind when you think of terrorism. How do they get their money? How do they get their money? As we can see from the definition, basically terrorism is about how you collect funds to plan terrorist attacks. As we can see here, there are some various sources. We have charities, wealthy individuals, legitimate businesses, governments, criminals, and criminal activities. Governments are still sponsoring terrorism, as we can see indirectly and even directly. Tax havens and other offshore centers have also been linked with terrorism finance. Charities are being used as fronts from which terrorism is being laundered, as we can see with the case of IHH Germany, in which was used as a front from which they collect donations from people, well-meaning individuals, and use it to fund terrorist attacks. Money laundering and terrorism finance are linked. Money laundering has to do with how we get criminal money and disguise it to become legitimate funds, and then how these funds are then being linked to use and sponsor terrorism. So we can see that these are linked. And because of this process, we don't really see how those funds move. We just notice that these terrorists have money. How? Most of it is thanks to money laundering. For many of you that don't know what money laundering is all about, this is the process. You get dirty money, you put it into the bank, which is what's called placing. Then it goes through a very sophisticated process using a lot of onshore and offshore banking entities. And then it comes out as legitimate money. And then some of this money are used for other criminal activities and terrorism activities. Financial institutions such as banks are a conduit pipe for money laundering. According to Antonio Maria Costa, head of the UN Office for Drugs and Crime, proceeds from money laundering and drugs were the only liquid investment capital that were available to banks that saved them from the financial crisis. Surprising, yes. The financial crisis was helped majorly thanks to terrorism finance and drug money. Without it, most of our banks would have been dead by now. According to some experts, London is still a money laundering center of the world. The banks in London and in many other cosmopolitan cities are still collecting these funds just so that they can keep their bottom line. They're only concerned about profits. They do not care the lives at stake. They do not care about the thousands and millions of lives that die daily as a result of terrorist attacks, of which they are an accomplice to because of the fact that they sponsor this they act as a conduit pipe in which these funds are channeled to these terrorists. Without them, terrorism would have been reduced to a very, very large extent, without all the killing and maiming from both sides. Just some examples. Why in Scandinavian countries like Iceland, Finland, Norway, financial crimes are more common. Organized crimes are common in countries like Italy, Japan, Nigeria. Money laundering and other violations. We can see here that HSBC was fined £1.2 billion recently for terrorism financing and money laundering. Others include, HSBC meanwhile is Britain's largest bank. Others include BNP Paribas, French's largest bank, 8.9 billion, Standard Chartered, 674 million. A good example of how the proportion of money laundered and the fine is given with the Bank of New York. $7 billion were laundered, but we only fined £38 million, less than 0.01%. Deutsche Bank, Germany's largest bank, £258 million. Credit Suisse, Switzerland's largest bank, $2.6 billion. We can clearly see from the Bank of New York that the punishment does not fit the crime. With the other higher figures, you would notice that the amount laundered was not given, probably in trillions and trillions of dollars that are being used to sponsor finance of terrorism on a monthly basis and even on a daily basis. These banks don't care. The punishment doesn't fit the crime. If I were to be a bank and I get fined by the regulatory authority 0.01% of the money I collect from terrorists to help terrorists, then what incentive do I have to stop it? The regulators are not doing their job. The fine does not fit the money laundered. This is a very big example. The US Attorney General Eric Holder said it himself. When he was asked, why did you let HSBC people go? Because they only paid the fine, nobody was jailed. He said, why? In his words, too big to jail. These banks have grown so powerful that they're even beyond the authorities of a country as powerful as the United States. We now let them go through their activities unchallenged, and everyone just keeps quiet. Previously, we thought we were safe. The banks thought they were safe. They thought their citizens were safe. But are we really safe? It's no longer a question of in the Middle East. We now have attacks in France, a G7 country. We had attack in Brussels, the seat of the European Union. When are we going to act? Is it until when there are bodies on our streets? Is that when we are going to act? How many of us has watched London Has Fallen? London Has Fallen, White House Down. Anyone? Okay, a couple of you have. This shows what could happen to our beloved Great Britain if these activities are not checked. If we continue to live our lives like there's nothing going on. If we continue to work on those stereotypes that is from just the Middle East, it doesn't affect us. When our banks down the road are helping these people to perpetrate these crimes, they must be brought to justice. They should be able to face the law. We shouldn't just let them go about their activities unchallenged. What can we see from this? Obviously, the media has failed us. I'm sure many of you didn't know about those big banks and the fines they've been charged recently. Why? Because the media wants to give us a false sense of security. They want us to think that it's just by imposing border restrictions or refusing to allow refugees to come to your country or our country or something like that that will solve the situation. I'm sorry, but that is not the case. Our banks are helping these people. They are sponsoring their activities indirectly. But they don't care. These banks are untouchable. This was also said by an anonymous police chief in the United Kingdom. He said these banks are untouchable. As a chartered accountant and someone who's doing a master's in finance, I can tell you the truth. The banking system is very complicated. They are known as SIFI, systematically important financial institutions. They cannot be allowed to fail because of the impact it can have on our financial stability. And so because of that, the banks, the government close their eyes and let them do whatever they want so that they can continue to remain profitable. The financial crisis, which happened in 2008, was caused because banks were carrying out risky activities. They were buying private jets for their CEOs and their directors. And then when the banks were about to collapse, taxpayers' money had to be injected to save these banks. We must demand accountability. The banks do not exist in and of itself. They have investors, they have employees, they have customers. We all have a responsibility to ensure that we don't allow these banks to continue to carry out these activities because our lives are on the line. Our lives are literally on the line if we let these banks continue to act the way they are acting. We have to ensure that there's integrity, there's morality, because this is going to be our savior. It's a collective fight. We must all work together. It happens everywhere. Africa, Asia, Europe, the United States. Terrorism knows no race, no gender. It knows no one. It could be you or I that could be a victim of an attack. We all have to work together. Together we achieve more. Seclusion breeds extremism. We shouldn't just put a certain group of people based on our like Louisa had said. We should open ourselves to try new things, to break stereotypes, because seclusion breeds extremism. A friend of mine once told me about the story in his state in Nigeria. It's called Jos, Plateau. They were living their happy lives, and then this group of people came with some radical beliefs, and they had compassion on them, quite all right. And then they just brought them in, and they just made a place for them and just kept them there. No one cared about them, no one thought what they were doing. It's not enough to just say you have an open door policy. We must be ready to integrate them, or else that will be even worse. And that's why I want to thank the people of London when they decided to appoint Sadiq Khan as their mayor. It shows that they are ready to integrate these people into their society, because that is the only way extremism will be removed from our lands. These people of Plateau didn't know this, and they just kept them somewhere. And then these people came decades later and started attacking the main citizens of that state. We must be ready to integrate them. We must be ready to show them love. We must all work together, because this fight is not a fight of a certain group of people. We must all march to these banks and demand that they be accountable for their actions. We must tell our relatives and our friends who work in banks to not forget the concepts of integrity, ethics, and morality. I leave you with this statement of mine. Money laundering and terrorism financing are financial crimes with disastrous moral and economic effects. They threaten a country's financial and external stability. We must act not only because it is morally right, but because it's in our interest to do so. Thank you.